말고와는 벨륜. So before anyone gets triggered by the title of this video, why creators need to move on from Tolkien and fantasy, just let me say this. I love Tolkien's works. And I've been a huge fan of Tolkien's ever since I watched the Peter Jackson films, which are right here. And read the books when I was in, I think, junior high school. And I owe much of what I do and what I am right now to Tolkien and his magnificent achievements. So the aim of this video is by no means to criticize Tolkien's works or Tolkien himself. It's rather to examine the current situation of the fantasy genre and, look at the potential problems. That's precisely the reason why I didn't title this video Why We Need to Move On from Tolkien, as opposed to the one I eventually chose, From Tolkienian Fantasy. So let me explain why I think there are some aspects in the modern fantasy genre that I think could be problematic. Tolkien is, in my opinion, the best conworlder to ever exist from the perspective of linguistic and cultural and mythological details. And I probably don't even need to address how Tolkien left a vast legacy, for authors and game creators and musicians to come after him. And just to give you an example, the elves, as we know them today, are pretty much based on Tolkien's version of elves, which is inspired by Norse and Celtic mythology and is completely different from, for example, maybe Shakespearean representation of elves. They are so different. And we can see such Tolkienian elves in many different works of fantasy, like Eragon and Shannara Chronicles. I think I might do another video on this particular topic in the future, because I think it's just a really fun thing to talk about, and I actually wrote a paper about perception of elves and how Tolkien changed it in the history of literature. I think it would be safe to say that after Tolkien, the formula of high fantasy equals elves and dwarves and dark lords and swords and magic, it has become very popular, and to this day it has continued to be, a sort of a common framework for this genre, for the high fantasy genre. So throughout the rest of this video, I will call this the Tolkien formula. So the Tolkien formula is in itself not a bad thing, obviously, because it certainly enabled many creators and authors to construct their own fictional universes and tell their own stories that are unique and compelling. However, in my opinion, I feel that this formula is not only becoming overused, it's sort of becoming a mere tactic to effectively gain people's attention. So the Tolkien formula has become so widespread in the genre that it almost feels like it's kind of a disadvantage not to use it when you could save your time and effort on building the world, setting up the world and the fictional races and your universe, and just jump right into the story and get your audience's attention. So I think to some extent this kind of the usage of formula is justified as effective storytelling, but as you could imagine, this may also result in the lack of originality. And if I were to be bold, I would argue that the prioritization of effectiveness over creativity may have to do with the commercial aspect of the high fantasy genre. Because in the current society, at least the capitalist society, where everything needs to be properly monetized in order to survive in the market, I imagine that the retention of the audience is crucial for any work of art to simply exist, and the Tolkien formula, which has survived the test of time, would be a great component to achieve stable income to, sustain the production of such works. So I think the line between this effective storytelling versus overusage of the formula could be mainly defined by what I call the justification of borrowing. So if you are to borrow from or refer to other works or employ a certain framework of world building, including the Tolkien formula, you will kind of need a certain reason to do so. The reason could be anything, as long as it makes it apparent that your story cannot be told in the way you'd like without the borrowing or the reference. So as an example, I would like to mention the word Mithril. If you are familiar with Tolkien, you would immediately think of Bilbo or Frodo's shining chainmail and or the Mines of Moria itself, because that's the source of Mithril as is mentioned in The Lord of the Rings. On the other hand, if you haven't seen The Lord of the Rings or haven't read it, the books, and are into video games, you would think of some sort of a rare item in your game that you can obtain through playing your game. And Mithril was originally a word in Sindarin that Tolkien created for his fictional mineral that appears in his Legendarium, and etymologically it means grey glitter. And apparently this word became so commonplace in the history of TRPG and video games that nowadays people use it without knowing it is a Sindarin word created by Tolkien. That's fine, I have no problems with that. But if you are a game creator or the like and are trying to create a high fantasy setting, in that case I feel like there should be at least some justification as to why this particular item or that substance in your game has to be Mithril, which is rooted deeply in Tolkien's Legendarium, of course, when you could come up with another name or another substance instead, and which could allow you to expand your fictional universe a bit. So I think that borrowings from works of the past could be effective and interesting if done properly, but unjustified borrowings, done consciously or not, it could limit the imaginativeness of your world. So actually, if you would allow me to digress a little, I feel this trend does not only apply to the Tolkien formula, but all sorts of mythology and folklore that are widely known. For example, characters and concepts from the Norse mythology such as Thor and Loki, Ragnarok, they seem to have gained popularity as they appear in many works of the fantasy or the sci-fi genre, even the MCU. People don't necessarily know the original mythological figure as opposed to their representations in popular culture that are often modified and transformed to fit the context. Another case of unjustified borrowing that tends to be, in my opinion, way worse is Celtic mythology, because many people know names and concepts like Cuchulainn and Dagda and Scarthach and Druids, but few actually know who or what they are. And this is because, again, the creators of modern fantasy have borrowed from Celtic mythology without adequate reasons to do so, and essentially just borrowed the names, changed their appearances and traits to fit the story that they want to tell. I generally like the Netflix series Shannara Chronicles, although I have not had the chance to read the source material. I was disappointed how the antagonist was named Dag the Moor, but I cannot see any reasons for him to be named after Dagda, one of the gods of Tuatha Dé Danann, who appears in the mythological cycle, one of the 4 cycles of Celtic mythology. So the funny thing is that the name Dagda literally means good god, but I couldn't tell if that's meant to be a kind of irony deliberately put in by the author of the book or not. I guess it's not really a problem if you are on the consumer side and enjoy the popular representations of such characters. But if you're doing as creator without said justification, I just feel like you are kind of missing out of a great opportunity to come up with your own kind of mythology that reflects your own original thoughts and philosophy. Another thing that bothers me quite often is that in high fantasy settings, characters' names are quite distinctly European, and there is no indication that there is a logical reason why they have modern European names in a world that is supposed to be completely separate from ours, right? To me, it appears there are many problems like this in the current high fantasy genre, particularly the MMORPGs, and most of them apparently result from trying to save the effort on world building and cultural setup. So Tolkien was a master of this kind of justification I've mentioned. So Tolkien created multiple Elvish languages, and the 2 most well fleshed out languages are Quenya and Sindarin, which were phonetically probably also grammatically influenced by Finnish and Welsh, respectively, although these languages are basically supposed to be unrelated to any existing languages. So in order to account for the existence of the two main constructed Elvish languages and their differences, he simulated hundreds and thousands of years of linguistic evolution of the Eldarin language group. David Salo, the linguist who worked on the Elvish lines in songs of the Peter Jackson films, has written a book called A Gateway to Sindarin, based on Tolkien's original works. And if you read this book, you can actually see that Tolkien had thought out the details, the minute details of linguistic changes that differentiated one branch of Elvish from another in the course of time, even the subtle dialectal differences within the same Sindarin languages, which almost freaks me out as an aspirant linguist and a conworder. This intense labor of explaining the process of linguistic evolution justified the fact that Quenya and Sindarin were aesthetically influenced by existing languages, essentially by saying that the sound and grammar of these languages just happen to be similar to Finnish and Welsh, and is a result of legit linguistic change that he mapped out by hand. So at this point you could be thinking, but Tolkien had the same issue, the same naming issue you just mentioned. Well, yeah, sure, the Lord of the Ring has characters whose name is like Sam and Baggins and Pippin, which are seemingly influenced by English and other existing languages, right? But does Tolkien really have the same naming issue? Not really, because his books, like The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings, are supposed to be translations from the manuscript that Frodo and Bilbo Baggins themselves wrote in a language called Westron. So the names included in the story were also translated from Westron to existing languages, which in this case is English. For example, the names of Frodo and Sam in Westron is Maula and Banazir. This underlying concept of translation resulted in an interesting problem when translating the English version into Japanese and other languages all around the world, but that's a story for another time. I guess what I'm trying to say here is that recycling old materials is not a bad thing, and people have been doing it the whole time. However, unfortunately, I personally feel that the overusage of the Tolkien formula and unjustified borrowings from existing works could damage the work's creativeness. MMORPGs, and especially smartphone ones, are starting to feel hollow and uniform and even stale. I really hope I'm not offending anyone here. In case anyone here is involved in such production of smartphone MMORPGs, please don't take this too seriously, because this is just my personal opinion. And there are tons of people who like this kind of stuff, and I have nothing against it. Yeah, but the thing is, I've installed and tried a dozen to back up my opinion in this video, and I ended up not being able to remember the story of any of them, almost any of them. So following these arguments, I think that the high fantasy genre needs something different from Tolkienian fantasy. It doesn't have to be totally different, but it needs to rely less on the effectiveness of prefabricated fantasy formula, if you will, and try new things. And I think this is one reason Game of Thrones was so successful overall, despite the fact that the final season was divisive at best. George R.R. Martin created the world of Westeros, which is in many ways similar to Tolkien's Middle-earth, and is also undoubtedly influenced by real-world events and geography and so on. But it is at the same time very different and unique. And most of all, I think that Martin did what Tolkien hadn't done with his world and the characters that he created. That is to depict a war in a fantasy universe from a more grounded and realistic and historical point of view. So that's why I think creators need to sort of move on from Tolkienian fantasy. It's okay to be, of course, influenced, and it's inevitable to be influenced by the works of the past, but I just feel like it's time we tried something different, just as George R.R. Martin did. I said we because I am trying to do exactly what I said by creating this Firaxionary universe, which is it's a Conworld, it's a constructed universe, and it's pretty similar, the world building aspects compared to Tolkien's Middle Earth. But I am trying to introduce different elements from many different genres of literature and film. Yeah, so the first published product of my Firaxionary world building is it's a film, and it's called Between the Two Worlds. And I've made a video where I talk about that film. I will link to that in the description below. And if you are watching this in like August, in the middle of August, you are lucky, because right now my film Between the Two Worlds is temporarily available for free on YouTube on this channel. And I will link to that in is it here or yeah. Either of these sites. Alright, yeah, if you enjoyed this video, you might want to check that out as well. And thank you all for watching, and all I've said throughout this video is just my personal opinion, just to make sure. If you have a different opinion on this regarding this matter, or just want to discuss modern high fantasy or sci-fi, please leave a comment in the comment section below. And if you enjoyed watching this video, please leave a like and subscribe. Also, if you like what I'm doing and would like to see more content coming out at a faster rate, please consider becoming my patron on patreon.com. There's also plenty of free stuff on my Patreon page, so yeah, so if you like this video, you might like the stuff on the Patreon page as well. Ok, na vai Rebellion.